The ASHE 2020 conference has begun. We hope that you've already been learning from your colleagues from across the country and around the world.
As you continue to experience ASHE 2020, be sure to engage in the conversation. You can do this through the chat function in breakout rooms, group discussions, in some interactive symposia, and also on social media.
Use the hashtag ASHE 2020 on social media to connect with others and share your conference experience.
While we'll miss running into friends in the hall, on the street, or at restaurants, we hope you'll continue to engage with colleagues throughout the conference.
We also know that sometimes technology isn't our friend. We want to remind you that if you have technical difficulties or questions, be sure to use the help chat in the bottom right corner of your screen or chat with an ASHE staff member in your breakout room.
We are grateful for the opportunity to continue learning from and connecting with you. Enjoy the session.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, and thanks for coming to the session. My name is Dr. Rosie Perez. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an associate professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. Today, I join you as a visitor and settler on the lands of the Anishinaabe, or People of the Three Fires, namely the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. In 1817, these nations ceded this land through the treaty at the foot of the rapids, some of which was designated for a college at Detroit, at which Indigenous peoples were eligible to enroll. As I occupy this land, I affirm the Indigenous peoples who live here now and those who were forcibly removed from this space. I also acknowledge the historic and ongoing struggles for Indigenous sovereignty, the effects of colonial violence, and the erasure of Indigenous peoples. Today, I also join you as the chair of the 2020 Bobby Wright ASHE Dissertation of the Year Committee. This award annually recognizes one or more exemplary dissertations in the field of higher education based on the high quality of methodology employed and the significance of the dissertation topic. This award was named in memory of Irvin Lee, also known as Bobby Wright, who died in 1991. Dr. Wright was an assistant professor and research associate affiliated with the Center for the Study of Higher Education in the College of Education at Pennsylvania State University. Prior to joining Penn State in 1989, Dr. Wright was the director of the Center for Native American Studies at Montana State University, where he received his doctorate in adult and higher education in 1985. He received his bachelor degree in business administration from the University of San Francisco in 1973 and his master's degree in American Studies at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Dr. Wright was also a proud gay Native American, and his historical work on Native Americans in higher education made visible narratives that were erased and ignored. As an educator and mentor, he worked to engage others in compassionate scholarship that worked to honor the dignity of others. This year's Bobby Wright ASHE Dissertation of the Year winner, Dr. Cinthya Salazar's work is certainly aligned with Dr. Wright's commitment to compassionate scholarship. Her dissertation, Collective Resistance in Higher Education, a participatory action study with and for undocumented college students in Virginia, used participatory action research to engage in co-research with students who identify as undocumented. Her work honored the humanity of her participants while advancing our collective understanding of student retention theories and pointing towards ways educators can very directly reduce barriers and better support undocumented college students. Congratulations, Dr. Salazar. We look forward to learning alongside you during this session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perez, for that introduction. Thank you everyone for joining this presentation today. I'm excited to share about the work that my co-researchers and I did, and I'll start sharing my screen to begin my presentation. So again, I'm Cinthya Salazar. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an assistant professor at Texas A&M University, and I am a graduate of the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Perez mentioned the title of my dissertation, and I am very honored to be here today. Before I begin, I really want to acknowledge the land that I am occupying today and that my institution is also occupying. It is physically situated in the original ancestral homelands of the Tonkawa tribe, so I pay respect to the Tonkawa peoples that continue to be present in the homeland. I also want to thank everyone who has supported me and really been part of this project and this work. First, I want to start by my co-researchers, Pau, Paula, and Alejandro. They have been working in this project and with me and have been part of my family, and I call them friends and mentees and a little bit of everything. And you can see here, they're in the picture. I don't think they were able to join the meeting or anything like that today, but I'll be speaking a little bit more about Pau, Paula, and Alejandro later. But this work and this award, I share that with them, as well as my dissertation chair, Dr. Michelle Espino-Lira, who I met even before I started my doctoral studies, and I have been so fortunate to have her as a mentor, as a guide throughout this process, as someone who really supported this work since the beginning. I never questioned my approach to the research, the methodology, and just offer support and encouragement throughout. You can see a picture of Dr. Espino holding me in her front yard because we could not have a ceremony, of course, this year due to the pandemic. And then my dissertation committee, Dr. Sharon Frisbrit, Dr. Tara Brown, Dr. Christina Gedrich, and Dr. Janelle Wong. They all are powerful women at the University of Maryland who were part of my committee and guided me and provided different insights throughout. You can see their departments and associations there listed on the screen. The 28 participants who share their narratives with us, with my co-researchers and I, and really help us understand more about how they were persisting in college and the issues that were affecting them. My familia, you can also see a picture of them here. We are all immigrants from Peru, and we are and have been, some of our family members are still dealing with immigration issues, and we are a formerly undocumented family, so we relate very closely to this topic. To all the scholars who have helped me think about this topic and the issues and paved the way for me to be here and be able to share this work with you all. Especially I want to thank Dr. Susana Munoz, Dr. Keninian Hasser, and Dr. Lindsay Perez-Uber, whose scholarship really helped me think more deeply about this work. And without them, this scholarship would not be able to be presented today. And there are many more scholars who have done PAR in higher education. Dr. Alejandro Covarrubias is one of the scholars that really helped me think about how to engage with PAR throughout these 2 years. And all my family and friends outside of, in Maryland, in Northern Virginia, in different areas who have supported this work. There are so many to mention, but you all have a special place in this dissertation. So thank you so much. And to the committee for honoring the participants' work and stories, as well as the work of my co-researchers. Thank you for selecting this dissertation, our dissertation, to be receiving this award and honoring us today. Thank you. So I want to start by knowing a little bit about who's here. So I know Mariana from ASHE is going to launch a poll, just very quick poll to know like who's here in the room with us today. So if you can all just like submit, if you're a faculty member, if you're a graduate student, a college administrator. Perfect. Great. I love it because we have a mix of faculty and graduate students. Thank you to the graduate students who are here. And you can do it, you will do it, it will get done. And then this is what I have planned for today and what I'm going to present, a little bit more about the background, the purpose. I'll spend more time on the methodology and research design, but I also want to hear from you and see what you want me maybe to focus a little bit more on. So Mariana, can you launch the second poll? Perfect. So can you close it, Mariana? And let's see. Okay, methodology, findings, implications. Okay, I see methodology is what's attracting a lot of people to be here today, so I'm excited about that. Thank you so much. So let me just start by giving you a little bit more background information on undocumented immigrants and students in the US. There are about 11 million undocumented people in the United States. And when we look at students and youth, there is an estimate of 98,000 undocumented students graduating from high school every year. About 5 to 10% of undocumented students go to college. This is an older statistic, so this may have changed, but this is really the only kind of like data point that we have when we are looking at who's going to college. And a lot of the issues that are affecting students when they go to college relates to federal, the lack of a federal policy to provide access, financial aid, and different contexts. And every state has different policies and practices that are affecting that transition from high school to college. When we look at how many students right now are enrolling higher education, there's about 458,000 undocumented students enrolling higher education across the US. And most of them are not necessarily DACA recipients. So I wanted to make sure that you all keep that in mind as we go through the presentation and the findings. And then when thinking about how many students are graduating from college, 1 to 3% of undocumented students is estimated to graduate every year. Now, this does not mean that 97% of them are not graduating from college, but the 6-year graduation rate is not really capturing their experiences and maybe the timelines or the longer timeframes that they may take to graduate from higher education. The study that I conducted with my co-researchers is situated in Virginia because to look at specific issues, you really need to focus in specific state context based on the different policies that exist across the US. And in Virginia, there's about 300,000 undocumented students. Virginia, at the time of the study, was one of the states that did not offer tuition equity policies, meaning that for undocumented students who did not have DACA, they have to pay 3 times the amount of tuition that a resident from the state was paying. This meant that most students in Virginia were DACA recipients who were in higher education due to the affordability. So DACA recipients were able to pay in-state tuition fees. It was estimated that about 2,000 undocumented students were graduating from high school in Virginia, and that across the state there were about 10,000 DACA recipients, and that 19% of them were enrolling college. So I really wanted in this study to understand how do the 19% of students who are enrolling higher education get to be part of the 1 to 3% that graduate every year, right? We know a lot about the barriers. We know a lot about how different contexts affect how students navigate higher education, but I wanted to focus on then how are they making it? How are they achieving the goal of degree attainment? Give me 1 second, because I just think I can go ahead and put closed captioning, maybe. Let me see. I don't know how to do that, but if I figure it out, like I'll come back to the closed captioning. But again, I wanted to understand then how are undocumented students navigating higher education, specifically looking at a large public university in Virginia, and how they were pursuing their educational goals by engaging 3 undocumented college students as co-researchers. The 3 undocumented college students that I mentioned are Pau, Paula, and Alejandro, and together we sought to investigate these research questions. What are the motivations of undocumented college students in Virginia to pursue and persist in higher education? How are they doing it? And in what ways does the context of Virginia distinctively impact their experiences? We looked at the barriers and also the knowledge and actions that students take to manage the barriers that they were encountering. For the analysis and the coding process, and also like to just shape the entire research design from the research questions, I put together a conceptual framework that integrated two different models. So first, it was the ecological developmental model by Suarez Orozco and colleagues. And this model was developed to intentionally and systematically analyze how having an unauthorized immigration status impacted the developmental outcomes of immigrants. Suarez Orozco and colleagues did not only focus on undocumented immigrants, they focused on different immigration status, including TPS, including, well, DACA wasn't available, wasn't an option at the moment, but they look at different options and how even just being part of a mixed status family impacted all the different outcomes of immigrants in the US, not only educational. So this framework was broader and it looked at different systems, a nested group of systems. So it's based on Bronfenbrenner's model, and it looked at the macro system, the exosystem, the mesosystem, and also the microsystem. In a way, this model was a little bit broader, but really captured all the levels that I wanted to analyze. So I integrated and added Padilla's model of expertise model of student success. And Padilla developed this model to really focus on assets and not necessarily look at student retention and persistence from a deficit perspective. Padilla theorized that when students come to college, college is like a black box, and inside that black box, there will be different barriers that students will encounter, but they will have to develop knowledge, mostly experiential knowledge, to understand what they need to do and what actions they need to take to overcome those barriers. So Padilla says that once the students are inside the black box, they encounter these barriers, they have knowledge, take action, and then they keep persisting and achieve student success. When I combine these two frameworks, I created the ecological model of undocumented student persistence as part of the dissertation to analyze the data and to frame the study. And in this model, I look at how different systems, the US, for example, the socio-political climate, the policies at the federal level, as well as the exosystem. So everything that was happening in Virginia, the climate of Virginia specifically, the policies of Virginia, and then the microsystem, which was the institution, Virginia Public University, how all of those impacted the barriers that students were encountering. And then what knowledge and what actions did they take to keep persisting and be successful in higher education? I employ a participatory action research methodology, and I know most of you wanted to hear more about this, so I'm happy to spend a little bit more of time speaking about this and the research design as well. And PAR really has three principles associated with the methodology. One, it has to be participatory, meaning that people who are affected by the phenomenon that you're investigating need to be part of the study as co-researchers. They need to be sharing power with principal investigators, and they need to be engaging all aspects of the research process. There are different ways in which you can have members of the community participating in the study beyond being just participants or co-researchers through PAR. For example, there can be an advisory board if some of the members of the communities are not able to spend that much time doing the research, then they can become like an advisory board. But in this case, I did not employ that approach. I asked 3 students to be co-researchers and be engaged in this process for over 2 years. And then the second principle of PAR is that it has to be, the project, the study needs to have transformative and social justice aims. In this case, it was to enhance the persistence of undocumented students. Personally, I really wanted to expand access to research opportunities for undocumented students, because a lot of times these research opportunities are not open for students who do not have an authorized immigration status. So because they're related to grants or there's money associated to it that has some limitations. But I wanted to, in a way, challenge that norm and that practice, and also just challenge overall how we do work in higher education and how we look at research and who we consider participants or who we share knowledge with or who we even ask to co-construct knowledge with us, right? And also, just transformation happened through the personal and collective conversations and reflections that my co-researchers and I were having. We really talk a lot about these issues and came up with different understandings of the phenomenon. In order for these two principles to happen, so if we think about engaging members of the community and having a social justice aim, you really need to situate the research. You need to bound it in a way, because let's say that you are doing a PAR study across the United States. How can you engage people across the United States, right? So it can become complicated. So in a way, you have to bound it a little bit more. And in this case, we bounded the study to Virginia Public University, and I'll explain why VPU, I think next, or in 2 slides. Oh, next. So VPU was the institution across Virginia who was the one with the reputation of being the most undocu-friendly, meaning that it was the one that was providing a lot of services, a lot of opportunities to undocumented students, and that when students were in high school, they were even thinking about VPU just because of that reputation. It was also the institution across the state, the 4-year institution that had the largest number of undocumented students at the time. It was about 300 students. They founded the first student organization in Virginia to advocate for efforts and policies to change. They were engaging the community, providing undocu-allied trainings, not only to members of the VPU campus, but outside, to like high school students, to families and parents. And they also had a formal advisory board that was composed by alumni, by some faculty and some administrators, trying to direct the work that VPU was doing. So more like a working group, but it was with members of the community as well. And so this was the research side for the study. And then Pau was, at the time that I asked Pau to be my co-researcher, she was the president, the external president for the student organization at VPU. And in her role, she was responsible for creating relationships with members of the community. So Pau, I approached Pau and explained to her about the research process and the project, and she immediately came on board. And then together, she was the first one that I recruited, right? So together, we decided who we were going to invite to be part of our research collective next. Because going back to the principles of PAR, which is sharing power, I could not just select or like, let's say invite all my co-researchers all at once, because I wanted to start that process of sharing power early on. So with Pau, we then decided to invite the second co-researcher and third. And I am happy to explain more about the process of selecting co-researchers, because before Paula and Alejandro came on board, there were 2 additional students that were at some point invited to being part of the research collective, but there were other issues that came up and they couldn't become members of the RC. So Paula and Alejandro came a little bit later to the project, as you can see, April 2018 and June 2018. So I can also answer more about that, like in the Q&A. But there were this was a long process, right? And that's something that when I was thinking, for example, as a graduate student, I knew that PAR was the way for me to conduct this research, and I didn't really mind spending the time or waiting or taking longer to honor the experiences of undocumented students the way that I wanted to honor them for this project. I think one thing that it is important to mention is that these require a lot of time commitment and a lot of energy from my co-researchers as well. and they received an honorarium because it was important to compensate them for their labor and the work that they were putting into this project. There were several ethical considerations that I had to take into account as I was going through the research process. And just to mention an example, because my co-researchers had to go through the human subjects certification process, for example, I couldn't request a waiver of signed consent for them. So they had to sign forms for IRB. And in a way, as you all know, IRB forms can be subpoenaed, right? So when I was thinking about who I could recruit to be part of the research collective, then I decided that they should be DACA recipients because they have more protections. And at the same time, when I asked Pau to be part of the research collective, she also agreed, and that's how we continue to recruit Paula and Alejandro and move forward. And then the other thing that, just as another example of ethical considerations, when I submitted IRB, instead of saying that my co-researchers had to be undocumented students, I said that my co-researchers had to be immigrant students. And that came about with conversations with the IRB director, because being an undocumented student means that you are an immigrant student. So that term in the IRB application provided more protections for my co-researchers. When doing PAR studies, there is a cyclical approach that usually has to take place, because PAR is about implementing what you're finding and what you're reflecting on throughout the entire research process. There were 5 phases associated with this study, and all the different cycles that are engaged, like that you can see here, involve cycles of planning, acting, observing, and reflecting. And I align these cycles to the phases of the study to be able to honor and in a way like adapt the principles of PAR to this investigation. I'll go more into detail into about the phases next, but let me just get a sip of water. Okay, so the study had 5 phases, and phase 1 was the development of the research collective. I know there are a lot of graduate students here, so I'll explain more when I defended my proposal and in a little bit when I get to that phase, because this was a different approach to the study. So phase 1 was the development of the research collective. This happened during June and July 2018. And that was purposefully like selected based on who my co-researchers were. They are students, right? So during the finals week, during the semester, it is harder to spend a lot of time and energy thinking about doing a research project. And I designed the study thinking about those breaks and taking advantage of those breaks as much as possible. During that phase, I developed a 7-week curriculum based on Dr. Alejandro Covarrubia's work. And during this curriculum, think about it as a mini qualitative research class. We talk about instruments and protocols. My co-researchers went through the human subjects certification process, and we look at the plan, the rest of the phases for the study, and thought about what changes we needed to make. I wasn't actively in the process of writing my proposal at that time. I had already drafted 3 chapters, but then my proposal became 4 chapters, and the 3 and 4 chapters had to be split, because 1 chapter was more explaining about participatory action research as a methodology, and the 4th chapter focused on the research design. So during these 7 weeks, we also developed relationships. Even though my co-researchers and I had spent some time in programs and events together, they didn't know me, and I needed to earn their trust as well, right? So I spent time with them. Every meeting that we had was at my house or my place, and then we had meetings over dinner, 3 to 4 hours. A couple of them were a few hours, just to get to know each other and spend time building the relationships. That became the foundation of the work moving forward. During phase 2, we tested the instruments that we had developed during phase 1 and that we had revisited. We conducted a pilot study, because one thing was to theorize or think what could work. And going back to the cyclical nature of PAR, we needed to see, okay, we're planning, but let's put it in action and see if it's working out or not. So we conducted a pilot study with 1 focus group and 11 individual interviews. And my co-researchers all conducted individual interviews, and we all facilitated the focus group together. For all the focus groups, I took a secondary role, and my co-researchers led the groups. This pilot study was not at VPU, because we discussed that we did not want to run the risk of not having enough participants later on for phase 3 of the study. And it was conducted at Virginia Community College. Virginia Community College shares a lot of the characteristics that VPU had. It was the 2-year institution with the largest number of undocumented students. It had a student organization, and the students were very active as well. And Alejandro, my co-researcher, he was attending Virginia Community College at the time. And he aspired to transfer to VPU. So we conducted this pilot study, and after we conducted the pilot study, we reflected on what had worked and what had not worked, and we decided to make changes to the protocol. In between phase 2 and phase 3 is when I defended my dissertation proposal. At the end of phase 2, I went back to the draft that I had and made changes based on what my co-researchers and I had agreed on, had done. One of the big changes that happened was related to the conceptual framework. During phase 1 and phase 2, my co-researchers provided a lot of feedback on what frameworks I had been integrating, and there was a third concept that I had added at the beginning when I was conceptualizing initially the study, and they didn't agree with that. They were like, this framework, this concept does not really relate. So I took it out, and it was something that was a collective decision, right? And that's all about sharing power. And it wasn't easy, and again, I can share more later. And it wasn't easy because when you have an idea, for example, about a framework, you have spent time thinking about it, and then my co-researchers were like, no, that does not apply to us. So I had to do a lot of personal work to readjust and honor them and share power with them. So phase 3 was data collection at Virginia Public University via 2 focus groups and 15 individual interviews. I also conducted 2 observations of campus programs related to immigrant students and undocumented students. Oh, I forgot to mention that during phase 2, at the end of phase 2, we started developing the code book with my co-researchers with just to practice some of the skills that we were gonna need later on. And we used the focus group transcript and one of the individual interview transcripts, each of us, to begin developing codes. And also we developed a priori codes using the framework already. And we had this code book that was already started and that we kept building on later on. So going back to phase 4, that's when we analyzed the data. Because this was a lot of work and demanded a lot of energy. My co-researchers were part only of the first cycle of the data analysis process. There were 3 cycles associated with this data analysis process. First, we coded and analyzed the focus groups, and we used Padilla's recommendations to develop taxonomies for all the barriers, for all the knowledge, and for all the actions that were coming up from the data. So we used Padilla's taxonomies idea, and we worked several weeks in this process during this cycle. And that's when my co-researchers were actively engaged. And then based on that work, I coded the individual interviews myself, analyzed the individual interviews myself to come up with like categories. And then the third cycle was comparing and contrasting what was coming up across all the sources of data. So taxonomies and the categories from the individual interviews My co-researchers served as peer debriefers during the second and third cycle. They were actively reading how I was writing the findings, how I was thinking about the categories, and providing feedback. We met several weeks during those 2 cycles, not every week, maybe like every 3 weeks or so, to just talk about what was going on and what was coming up. We were also using a lot of just like Google Docs, and they were providing comments and adding their edits as we went along the data analysis process. So by the end of phase 4, I had completed the findings chapter in a way, right? And then, and I say in a way because obviously this is like multiple versions, right? As you're writing findings, you have to go back and forth, obviously, with your dissertation chair and keep editing until you have the final document. And then phase 5, because PAR asks us to take action based on the findings and share the knowledge with the community that is part of the investigation, we decided to develop a mobile application with my co-researchers, because my co-researchers went back to the students at VPU and told them, this is what we're finding. What do you need that will help you navigate higher education or this institution better? So they asked about a tool that they could use to navigate all the challenges and just exchange the information that they each had, because they had so much knowledge. And unfortunately, right, as you can see from the timeline, March 2020 is when we started being in the pandemic actively, and that has taken longer like to come to fruition, right? Right now, Alejandro, he's a computer science major. He is working on the application because he has an internship that is allowing him to spend time with the application, but it has taken much longer just to think about what we want to do. My co-researchers were the ones responsible for taking and for implementing the action. So we planned the action, we assigned responsibilities, we thought about what we wanted to do, but they were the ones who were going to take ownership of the implementation of the actions. And I'll talk a little bit more. So for the dissertation findings, I focus on phase 3 of the study, and there were 16 unique participants. They were all DACA recipients, and you can see more information about them here. I do want to bring attention to this idea of how we accounted for their class year or classification, right? You can see here that we are using credits instead of, let's say, first year, sophomore, junior, because, and going back to the background and context, right? Because a lot of undocumented students take longer to graduate. They stop at some points, they come back. So it was important to capture those unique experiences and with terms that they felt comfortable with. So for example, one of the participants had been in college for almost 9 years, and he was just shy of 90 credits. So putting the label of a junior for him was not honoring his experiences. And that's why we use the credits instead of those other labels. I will share more about the findings because I also know that's something that you all wanted to be interested, that you were interested in. So there were 4 like central findings related to the study, and in particular, and I'll go into each of one, and each of them have sub-themes. But for the first finding, really revealed that the requirements to qualify for in-state tuition in Virginia, so being a DACA recipient, created significant barriers to undocumented students. What it was kind of surprising is that a lot of times we think of DACA as a positive, and don't get me wrong, it provides a lot of benefits, and at the same time, it's not an effective solution for all the problems, right? So in this case, for undocumented students in Virginia, having their tuition classification dependent on DACA, and what was happening with DACA at the time was that it was being challenged in the Supreme Court. It was uncertain what was going to happen with DACA. Students ended up having doubts, and their emotional well-being was very affected throughout this process. They also didn't have concrete plans, and they were feeling uncertain about their future and what was going to happen with their personal and professional prospects, right? So for them, the students spoke very negatively about DACA and how DACA was dependent on those macro level and macro system climate and situations. I'll go ahead and just present on one of the sub-themes today based on time, because I really want to spend time answering your questions. And I will be focusing on DACA-dependent graduation. So for this part, I'm going to ask you if you've been taking pictures of the slides, if you can to avoid taking pictures, because I'll present some of the quotes from students. So just to be sensible and respectful of their narratives and stories, I would appreciate if you don't take any pictures for the quotes. But this quote that I'm going to show you is from Jennifer. And Jennifer is a participant from Honduras, and she arrived to the United States when she was 10 years old. She was a full-time student at VPU and was paying her tuition with full scholarships, like national scholarships. She was a recognized student at the national level. However, the scholarships that she was receiving were just enough to pay the in-state tuition rate. So without DACA, if she had to pay out-of-state tuition, then those scholarships were not going to be enough. Jennifer was one of the students who transferred right after Trump was elected in 2016. She transferred to VPU, and she is an educator and wanted to do a master's. So she added a one-year master's program that she could complete right after her bachelor's degree, and was really worried about what was going to happen if she lost DACA and the tuition equity policies. And she said, with the whole climate that's been going on, like, will we have DACA? Will we not have DACA? What's going to happen? I felt like I've had to rush myself. If I hadn't rushed myself, I probably wouldn't be graduating in spring 2019. I'm constantly worried, like, what if? I thought something was going to happen to DACA. Mine was due to expire this year in January. So I was like, what if it expires? What if I don't qualify for in-state tuition the last spring semester? What about the last year of grad school that I have to do? I feel like I've had to add on more classes. I think the most I've taken is 17 credits, but 16 or 17 credits I've started taking just because I wanted to make sure that I would graduate on time. My DACA is going to expire soon, and I want to be able to complete everything that I need to with in-state tuition. The phenomenon that I am referring to in my dissertation is the DACA dependency. And becoming DACA dependent is negative, like becoming dependent on anything, right? So one, as you can see here, Jennifer is really talking about not necessarily she started adding credits, right? Like that's what was a problem for Jennifer. She felt the need to add more credits and then be more stressed academically, just because her graduation was dependent on DACA and the continuation of in-state tuition for her in Virginia. The second theme refers to how participants were dissatisfied with VPU support and resources. They perceive administrators as unprepared to work with students based on their immigration status, especially as they were navigating the in-state resident tuition policies and process. Participants expected to find more support at VPU, more mental health resources, but those resources were not available. So they were disillusioned and disappointed because they had this idea that VPU was an undocu-friendly institution. Now, one of the arguments that I make later when I'm discussing the dissertation is that being undocu-friendly is not enough, that we need to think about becoming undocu-serving institutions and how do we meet the unique needs of students. But at the same time, what does that mean, right? Becoming undocu-serving. So because participants, again, they wanted to attend VPU. They had heard about VPU even from before when they were in high school, but they were disillusioned when they came to campus. I'll show you a quote for one of the sub-themes, and this is a quote from Eduardo. And Eduardo was one of the participants who had participated in one of the Undocumented trainings at his high school. And that really made him want to go to VPU. Eduardo and a lot of the participants were referring to just one administrator on campus as the support structure, and that's very common in the literature and the work that my peers and colleagues have done before me. And this administrator has a pseudonym in the dissertation because she kept coming up as the person who was the one helping all students. However, when students were at other spaces like the financial aid office, for example, they did not necessarily encounter support. And I'll show you the quote from Eduardo. My first semester, I was classified out of state as an out-of-state student. And we, my family and I, didn't know. I wasn't aware. We paid the $16,000 for the semester. Then when I talked to the financial aid guy, it was like, all right, you just need to set up an appointment. I went to talk to him and we're talking. Why is this? Because of this documentation. It was really like una conversación breve, muy breve. He said, necesitas esto, esto, y ya, se acabó. And I was like, can you walk me through it a little bit more? Could you do that for me? There's so much more other documentation that goes in the process. And for them, they could have said, there's gonna be this little paper that can make a big difference. Eduardo and his family went into debt and asked a lot of community members to chip in to pay the $16,000 tuition. This $16,000 would have covered 4 semesters at the in-state tuition rate. Eduardo qualified for in-state tuition because he had DACA. However, this administrator did not provide the information that he needed to be able to go through the process. Think about this, Eduardo was a recent high school graduate, and regardless of age, everyone deserves to know more and the time to understand the policies and the process, right? One thing that was really notable is that Eduardo, when he was talking about this, he said, I don't want them to hold my hands. I don't want them to, I know I'm an adult. I know I need to take care of these things. However, I was expecting more support because this wasn't an undocu-friendly institution. And then the third theme really surfaced the role of family and how family came up as a critical microsystem that provided support and motivation for undocumented students to pursue their goals and persist. It helps students to strive academically. They remember the parents' sacrifices, their family sacrifices, and they found motivation when they were recollecting those stories from their families. However, the findings and the data also show that families serve as a source of stress for students, and that a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of the participants talk about family trauma that was impacting how they were, the barriers that they were navigating in addition when they were going through higher education. And one of the participants who spoke about family with a deep sense of respect and appreciation was Aziza. And Aziza is the student, as you may be recalling from the sample, who was not of Latinx heritage. Aziza is Pakistani, and she arrived to the United States when she was 2 years old. She was a full-time student, and her parents were helping her pay for college, as well as some local scholarships. And Aziza kept recalling a lot of instances and a lot of messages that her family was providing to her when she, even when she was a young girl. So she remembers in kindergarten, and I'll show you the quote in a minute, but she remembers in kindergarten how she got an A or something, and it was like a star on a test, and her dad gave her an encyclopedia book, and that was a gift because she remembers how that encyclopedia book helped her see the value of education since an early age. And she says, my parents always told me that education is the way to go. One thing that my dad would always say as I got older was, you know, this isn't Pakistan, this is America. We're outsiders, but the way you can be able to look at them in the eye and change things and Sheen thinks that they have is, if you get us to a certain level, you need to get your education, you need to obtain it, and not forget your past, and always strive for something better. Because education is the one thing that no one can take away from you. They always supported it. They always encouraged me. They always spent money on two things, no matter what. Good food, we didn't eat out, we ate mostly at home, and books and education, they said. There's nothing bigger than this. What was really interesting, so Pau was my co-researcher who interviewed Aziza, and when I was listening to that interview, it was really interesting because Pau asked Aziza about this idea of the American dream, and really Aziza and her family and the parents of Aziza didn't really question this American dream, right? They kept believing that through education they could achieve and be at the same level. So the parents of Aziza were not necessarily engaging in that critical discussion, and Aziza, to an extent, still believed in that American dream that her parents were fostering. And the last finding really uncovered what was inside the black box of higher education for students at VPU. As you may recall from the conceptual framework, I talk about Padilla thinking about college as a black box in which you experience different barriers that you can overcome through knowledge and actions. However, for the participants in this study, they necessarily couldn't overcome the barriers because the root of the issue, their immigration status, was not addressed. So what happens is they manage the barriers, not overcome them. They were able to manage the barriers through knowledge and actions that became part of this toolbox. So with the findings, my co-researchers talk about how all these different students had so much knowledge and they were doing all these different things to manage the barriers. But by engaging in those actions, it became heavier and more burdensome for them to keep going, right? So they were still managing, but it was really heavy and took a toll on them and their well-being, as well as their families. So the way I thought about conceptualizing this was as a recurrent cycle of persistence. And I'll show you the graphic in a second. So as you can see here, you see undocumented students are coming into the black box of higher education. And Padilla says that the first barrier that students encounter are inside the black box. However, for undocumented students, that's not the case. Usually the first barriers happen as they're transitioning from high school to college, which is why I'm extending the black box here to represent that transition. And once they encounter the barrier, they develop knowledge, take actions, and they keep going on. Then they encounter another barrier, they develop more knowledge, you can see the plus, take more actions, and keep going on. And that's what why this is the cycle of recurrent persistence toward their educational goals. The motivations are at the bottom, serving as a foundation to keep them going, in this case, family and other motivations that they had. And what I was talking about getting being heavier and that toolbox being more of a burden is represented with the bigger loops. And I'll present to you two quotes from students that speak more in depth about this recurrent cycle of persistence. So first, you can see Ricardo. Ricardo was one of the students who had been pursuing his higher education for almost 9 years, the student that I mentioned earlier. And Ricardo really talked about this phenomenon, saying, if you get over one barrier, there's still another barrier that's there. You never really pass them. Like there's always something else that's gonna come to you. I guess that you never really overcome them. You just manage them. And the barriers are sort of like the taller, or like they're different, or they shift, like they evolve into something else. And also Marta talked about this. Marta is one of the students who had graduated recently from college. There were 3 recent graduates from VPU. And she said, even if it doesn't apply to school, it applies to your workspace. You're still going to be undocumented. I'm sorry, you're still going to be that undocumented, DACA-mented person in your workspace, even if the people don't know that you are. That's still a barrier. Or say your company is flying to Tokyo for a business trip, you can't do that. There are things that you have to manage, but not necessarily overcome. Again, this is representing that phenomenon of the recurrent cycle that doesn't end and doesn't start or finish with college either. To start wrapping up, there are four main ways in which my co-researchers and I are adding to the literature. One is by uncovering the experiences of undocumented students in the Commonwealth of Virginia, one of the states that had DACA-dependent policies and practices, and that even though, for example, well, the policies in Virginia, let me mention that quickly, have changed now. This summer, there was a bill enacted, and now undocumented students can pay in-state tuitions with or without DACA. But at the time, right, and when we think about this research, there are still a lot of states and a lot of institutions that only offer in-state tuition for DACA recipients. And by exposing how the experiences of these students are related and dependent on DACA, then we can inform practice and policies for other contexts as well. By advancing PAR and working with undocumented college students as co-researchers, I am very proud of the work that we did and the relationships that we were able to develop with my co-researchers. And overall, in higher education research, we're not used to using PAR as much either. Then advancing the ecological model of undocumented student persistence. The framework that I developed for this dissertation can be applied to different contexts. So I invite you all to consider using it if you want to analyze how that looks at different contexts and institutions. And then by also exposing the social political realities that were impacting undocumented students right after the 2016 elections. I know it is really odd to think that we have gone through another cycle of elections. And also just keep in mind that just because we have a different administration now, these issues are not gonna go away necessarily, okay? And just to think a little bit about the implications for research, I mentioned earlier that I argue for undocu-serving institutions in my dissertation, but what really makes an undocu-friendly institution? And an undocu-serving institution, right? Like, how do we compare both? Also, we need to understand more about the impact of state financial aid policies on the persistence of undocumented students, because we have focused on in-state tuition or equity bills, but how about financial aid? We need to keep understanding more about these issues. The work of some of my colleagues, like Dr. Jesus Cisneros, for example, has looked at institutional agents, right? Also Dr. Shelton as well. And we also need to understand more about faculty, because a couple of students in this study mentioned a few faculty members that were helpful, but not to the extent that allow us to identify them as a support structure. If they are a support structure, right? And to move on to policy implications, I think at the institutional level, we need to conduct policy reviews. We need to look at what are we requiring for students when they're applying to scholarships, to programs, to even majors, to be able to expand access to undocumented students. We also need to advocate for the implementation of non-DACA dependent state tuition policies, and also non-DACA dependent financial aid or institutional scholarships. When we think about practice, we definitely need to keep addressing the issue of finances and address that urgent need that students have, because there are so many barriers for them to access financial aid support. So scholarships at the institutional level are important. We also need to do a better job training our colleagues and training institutional agents so that they can become more knowledgeable about the issues affecting undocumented students. fostering relationships with families and community organizations are critical. VPU did have a lot of the programming open to families and communities. So that was really important to be able to start building that trust and relationship because, and especially, for example, if we're going to ask students to come live on our campuses, then we need to earn their trust, and we need to do that through these relationships. And I'm gonna stop there because I know you probably want to have, I want to have more time for questions, but I just want to end with this. These are some pictures of my co-researchers and I, and I also want to thank and mention that this research was supported by several institution grants at the University of Maryland, and also the Ford Foundation, who provided me the Ford dissertation scholarship. And if you want to cite any of my work related to what I argue about, like undocumented institutions or DACA-dependent phenomenon, this is the citation. My dissertation is not public yet, but I'll be submitting some articles for publication, so I will look forward to sharing that work with you in the future. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll come back to the room.
Thank you, Dr. Salazar. A minute to exhale. There was a question in the chat. I'm going to help monitor Q&A, so please yourself, but I think we can start with the first question posed by Jackie. So how do you discuss frameworks with student co-researchers in a way that honors the knowledge they hold while also making it more digestible for them?
Great question. So when we were doing the development of the research collective over the summer, during that week, we spent a full week just looking at the three ideas or three conceptual frameworks I had originally looked at. And what I asked them to do, so before the meetings, my co-researchers had to do readings, and they were spending about 5 to 7 hours each week engaging in this project during this phase. So when they were doing readings, they would use like a Google Doc or come with notes specifically based on the framework. And then I would do like a mini like lecture presentation on the framework to really kind of like deconstruct all these ideas. And at the same time, asking them, then when you think about what impacts your experiences, for example, thinking about the systems, that was one of the easiest ones for them because they were living it already. They already had that knowledge, right? They were already saying, oh, at the federal level, I am impacted in this way. At the state level, this is the policy that's impacting me. So when they were answering those questions and making those connections, then I was saying, okay, that's called the exosystem, for example, right? So making it more tangible that way for them. But they had to do readings and they had to come with questions, and then I will explain that to them. One of what I'll mention is the third concept that I had in mind was resistance capital, and from Yoso's community cultural wealth model. And my co-researchers, they understood the resistance capital, and I actually included in the dissertation a lot of I think it's like 10-12 pages of like the dialogue that we had, because they perceive resistance as something negative, not as something positive that they were using to persist. And that's why that concept was taken out of the framework.
So there's another question in the chat. Can you share more about you and your co-research? Can you share more about how you and your co-researchers are connecting with college administrators on this work? What do you think is most important for administrators to consider right now?
Thank you for that question. So remember when I talk about the phases, after phase 2, based on the pilot study data, because we wanted to also like honor and take some actions based on that data, we developed a 2-page report for Virginia Community College with some recommendations based on the focus groups and the individual interviews. We met with the dean and the director of financial aid. My co-researcher Alejandro managed the meeting, and we provided I really was there just as support for him in case, they had questions about anything else. But one way that we decided to do that was because Alejandro had this connection with the dean and was involved with the student organization. And he said, can I present the research findings because these can help? Because they said, we don't have the data. We don't know, this is happening, but not necessarily here. We are undocu-friendly. And we were like, no, not quite. So with that 2-page report, we went back to the administrators. Alejandro handled the meeting. I was, again, there to support. Now, unfortunately, they only implemented one of the action recommendations from that, which was related to the admissions website for Virginia Community College. At Virginia Public University, one relationship that was really strong throughout the process was the administrator that students were mentioning as the only person who was supportive of them. She became a friend of mine because we were working together and I was sharing the data with her as we were going through so that she could, because she was sitting in the advisory board for the organization, she could use those data points at the advisory board. And that's the beauty of PAR. Right? Because when we think about PAR, we need to share the data. It's a community project, it's a community owned, and maybe that's not the way we're used to 100% in higher education of doing our work, but we need to, I think, I don't know, maybe get out of our heads of like, oh, it's just our research, right? It's our research. And that's one way that we work together with that administrator who had already that position at the institution to be able to advocate for policies. We wanted to do a report and a meeting again with those administrators, but again, the pandemic happened and that right after we wrap up the work and we have not been able to do that. 2 of my co-researchers graduated from the institution. So Pau and Paula are already graduates, and they are taking also a break from the work that they were doing for free to the university, right? So Alejandro is the one who's managing the application, and while we wanted to inform policies and practices at the institution, we also kept in mind that we were mostly focusing on addressing the issues relevant to the students. What do the students need, and centering those needs more than the institution wants. So that's why we went with the action of the mobile application, because that's what the students wanted to use and needed. And Alejandro, luckily, again, he got a paid internship to develop the app, because if not, it will be like work for free as well. So, yeah.
There's a question. How do you see PAR being used differently for master's level programs or practitioners to use compared to a research study?
So the work that Alejandro Covarrubias did is with master's students. He was a student at the University of San Francisco, a doctoral student. He's a graduate now. And for his dissertation is available. What he did is he engaged 2 master's students in the Student Affairs and Higher Education program to work with them as co-researchers. That way, they were also exposed to the methodology and research methods and preparing to go to grad school if they wanted to later and use that work and publish, right? I think, I guess I want a clarifying question about thinking about master students as co-researchers or master students as participants, or how are you thinking about it?
And unmute myself. More so in an applied field for masters in master's programs, student affairs programs. Like, do you see a benefit of PAR being adopted in training masters and student affairs practitioners?
Yes, I do see the challenge of time, because master's programs are usually like 2-year programs or less. And I think one of the considerations will be the amount of time that you can commit to the community, because you cannot really just come and go. And it's important for the trust and to honor the narratives and the experiences of people to stay longer in the community. I'm not gonna lie, like I moved this summer and I struggled a lot. I felt that I was at some points betraying the community, or that I was abandoning the community. And it was a really big challenge to make that decision. When I was applying to jobs, even, I know this is like maybe not random, but it's something to consider. When I was applying to jobs in the fall, I talked to my co-researchers before anyone, because I felt that they were so invested in this project, and then I was gonna go, and how are we going to stay connected, right? So fortunately, we've been connected, but that is important, and that's why, like, when you're working with master's students, thinking about what that relationship means, and in what ways can they be committed to the community and respect their time and not just come and go. I think we also have to think about part, maybe not only core researchers being students, but also our colleagues, administrators at institutions that are already doing a lot of this work. So how can we engage them as core researchers when we are thinking about policies and practices, and depending on the nature of the study as well? I don't have the best answer for that, but some thoughts.
There is another question. Can you share how you managed that this was your dissertation and you needed it to graduate, but also honoring how time intensive this was to complete?
Yes, so one of the main issues was about the writing of the findings, because we were sharing the work, and the data is ours, and at the same time, I had to do the findings by myself to be able to complete the dissertation requirements. So that was something that was clear on the expectations of my core researchers, and also like the expectations with my dissertation chair. I think for me, I did an exercise during the summer of 2017, before I even defended, before I was drafting my proposal, about reflecting what was important to me. And because I was an undocumented student when I went to college, and I never really felt that those opportunities were available, right? And also when we look at the research, and when we look at the opportunities available to produce knowledge in this way, the way that it's maybe validated and accepted in communities, right? I felt that it didn't matter if it takes me longer, or if I need to delay my graduation to honor the experiences of students and co-construct knowledge with them. That this dissertation really would not necessarily have the same impact on me, or just in general when I think about the research, if it wouldn't be for them, right? Like it had to be with them. So I am honored that they were able to trust me in this process, but that was a personal decision, obviously, that I had to make, also considering finances and other aspects of life that are important. So one advice that I received at some point was, if you are not able to do this right now, then that doesn't mean that you're not able to do it later either, right? So depending on your circumstances, maybe for your dissertation, you cannot engage in PAR, but maybe later on you can, or you can do some aspects of PAR, and there are different ways to do that. I feel very fortunate that I was able to do this for my work. Yeah.
So I'm conscious of the time. We have about 1 minute remaining. At this time, I would, if you're comfortable unmuting yourself, I hope we might congratulate or use the reaction, since we're in Zoom, to thank Dr. Salazar for her willingness to share her wisdom with us today. If you want to hear more or be at the awards ceremony, it is on Saturday at, I want to say, 3 p.m. Central, and it is accessible to, you don't have to be registered for the conference to be able to attend the award ceremony. So if you have folks that you think would like to come and celebrate with Dr. Salazar, I encourage you to join us then as well. So thank you all for attending today.
Thank you so much.